Unfair contract terms. Act 1977. 1977 Chapter 50. Arrangement of sections. Part 1. Amendment of law for England and Wales and Northern Ireland. Section 1. Scope of Part 1. Introductory. Avoidance of liability for negligence, breach of contract, etc. 2. Negligence liability. 3. Liability arising in contract. Point 4. Unreasonable indemnity clauses. Liability arising from sale or supply of goods. 5. Guarantee of consumer goods. 6. Sale and hire purchase. 7. Miscellaneous contracts under which goods pass. Other provisions about contracts. 8. Misrepresentation. 9. Effect of breach. 10. Evasion by means of secondary contract. Explanatory provisions. 11. The reasonableness test. 12. Dealing as consumer. 13. Varieties of exemption clause. 14. Interpretation of Part 1. Part 2. Amendment of law for Scotland. 15. Scope of Part 2. 16. Liability for breach of duty. 17. Control of unreasonable exemptions in consumer or standard form contracts. A. EC. 50 Unfair Contract Terms Act 1977. Section 18. Unreasonable indemnity clauses in consumer contracts. 19. Guarantee of consumer goods. 20. Obligations implied by law in sale and hire purchase. Contracts. 21. Obligations implied by law in other contracts for the supply of goods. 22. Consequence of breach. 23. Evasion by means of secondary contract. 24. The reasonableness test. 25. Interpretation of Part 2. Part 3. Provisions applying to whole of United Kingdom. Miscellaneous. 26. International supply contracts. 27. Choice of law clauses. 28. Temporary provision for sea carriage of passengers. 29. Saving for other relevant legislation. 30. Obligations under Consumer Protection Acts. General. 31. Commencement, amendments, repeals. 32. Citation and extent. Schedules. Schedule 1 Scope of SS. 2 to 4 and 7. Schedule 2 Guidelines for application of reasonableness test. Schedule 3 Amendment of enactments. Schedule 4 Repeals. C.501. Elizabeth 11. Unfair contract terms. Act 1977. 1977 Chapter 50. An act to impose further limits on the extent to which under the law of England and Wales and Northern Ireland civil liability for breach of contract, or for negligence or other breach of duty, can be avoided by means of contract terms and otherwise, and under the law of Scotland civil liability can be avoided by means of contract terms. The 26th of October 1977 T1E it enacted by the Queen's Most Excellent Majesty, by and with the advice and consent of the Lords Spiritual and Temporal, and Commons, in this present Parliament assembled, and by the authority of the same, as follows. Part 1. Amendment of law for England and Wales and Northern Ireland. Introductory. 1. L. For the purposes of this part of this Act, negligence, scope of, means the breach Part 1. Of any obligation, arising from the express or implied terms of a contract, to take reasonable care or exercise reasonable skill in the performance of the contract. B. Of any common law duty to take reasonable care or exercise reasonable skill but not any stricter duty. 2c. 50 Unfair Contract Terms Act 1977. Part 1 1957 c. 31. 1957 c. 25. N.I. C. Of the common duty of care imposed by the Occupiers Liability Act 1957 or the Occupiers Liability Act Northern Ireland 1957. 2. This part of this Act is subject to Part 3, and in relation to contracts, the operation of Sections 2 to 4 and 7 is subject to the exceptions made by Schedule 1. 3. In the case of both contract and tort, Sections 2 to 7 apply except where the contrary is stated in Section 6(4) only to business liability, that is liability for breach of obligations or duties arising from things done or to be done by a person in the course of a business, whether his own business or another's, or b. from the occupation of premises used for business. Purposes of the occupier, and references to liability are to be read accordingly. 4. In relation to any breach of duty or obligation, it is immaterial for any purpose of this part of this Act whether the breach was inadvertent or intentional, or whether liability for it arises directly or vicariously. Avoidance of liability for negligence, breach of contract, etc. Negligence 2. 1. A person cannot by reference to any contract term, liability, or to a notice given to persons generally or to particular persons exclude or restrict his liability for death or personal injury resulting from negligence. 2. In the case of other loss or damage, a person cannot so exclude or restrict his liability for negligence except in so far as the term or notice satisfies the requirement of reasonableness. 3. Where a contract term or notice purports to exclude or restrict liability for negligence, a person's agreement to or awareness of it is not of itself to be taken as indicating his voluntary acceptance of any risk. Liability arising in contract. 3. L. This section applies as between contracting parties where one of them deals as consumer or on the other's written standard terms of business. 2. As against that party, the other cannot by reference to any contract term, when himself in breach of contract, exclude or restrict any liability of his in respect of the breach, or b. Claim to be entitled I. To render a contractual performance substantially different from that which was reasonably expected of him, or Unfair Contract Terms Act 1977 c. 53. E. In respect of the whole or any part of his Part 1 contractual obligation, to render no performance at all, except in so far as, in any of the cases mentioned above in this subsection, the contract term satisfies the requirement of reasonableness. 4. 1. A person dealing as consumer cannot by reference to unreasonable any contract term be made to indemnify another person, whether indemnity a party to the contract or not, in respect of liability that may bear clauses incurred by the other for negligence or breach of contract, except in so far as the contract term satisfies the requirement of reasonableness. 2. This section applies whether the liability in question a. is directly that of the person to be indemnified or is incurred by him vicariously, b. is to the person dealing as consumer or to someone else. Liability arising from sale or supply of goods. 5. L. In the case of goods of a type ordinarily supplied for guarantee, private use or consumption, where loss or damage of consumer a. arises from the goods proving defective while in goods consumer use, and b. results from the negligence of a person concerned in the manufacture or distribution of the goods. Liability for the loss or damage cannot be excluded or restricted by reference to any contract term or notice contained in or operating by reference to a guarantee of the goods. 2. For these purposes, goods are to be regarded as in consumer use when a person is using them, or has them in his possession, for use, otherwise than exclusively for the purposes of a business, and b. Anything in writing is a guarantee if it contains or purports to contain some promise or assurance, however worded or presented, that defects will be made good by complete or partial replacement, or by repair, monetary compensation or otherwise. 3. This section does not apply as between the parties to a contract under or in pursuance of which possession or ownership of the goods passed. 6. 1. Liability for breach of the obligations arising from sale and Section 12 of the Sale of Goods Act 1893, sellers. Hire purchase. Implied undertakings as to title, etc. 56 and 57 Vict. B. 4c. 50 Unfair Contract Terms Act 1977. Part 1 B. Section 8 of the Supply of Goods, Implied Terms, Act 1973 c. 13. 1973. The corresponding thing in relation to hire purchase cannot be excluded or restricted by reference to any contract term. 2. As against a person dealing as consumer, liability for breach of the obligations arising from Section 13, 14 or 15 of the 1893 Act. Sellers' implied undertakings as to conformity of goods with description or sample, or as to their quality or fitness for a particular purpose. B. Section 9, 10 or 11 of the 1973 Act. The corresponding Things in relation to hire purchase cannot be excluded or restricted by reference to any contract term. 3. As against a person dealing otherwise than as consumer, the liability specified in subsection 2 above can be excluded or restricted by reference to a contract term, but only insofar as the term satisfies the requirement of reasonableness. 4. The liabilities referred to in this section are not only the business liabilities defined by section 1(3), but include those arising under any contract of sale of goods or hire purchase agreement. Miscellaneous contracts under which goods pass. 7. 1. Where the possession or ownership of goods passes under or in pursuance of a contract not governed by the law of sale of goods or hire purchase. Subsections 2(4) below apply as regards the effect, if any, to be given to contract terms excluding or restricting liability for breach of obligation arising by implication of law from the nature of the contract. 2. As against a person dealing as consumer, liability in respect of the goods' correspondence with description or sample, or their quality or fitness for any particular purpose, cannot be excluded or restricted by reference to any such term. 3. As against a person dealing otherwise than as consumer, that liability can be excluded or restricted by reference to such a term, but only insofar as the term satisfies the requirement of reasonableness. 4. Liability in respect of the right to transfer ownership of the goods, or give possession, or b. the assurance of quiet possession to a person taking goods in pursuance of the contract. Unfair Contract Terms Act 1977 c. 55. Cannot be excluded or restricted by reference to any such term Part 1 except insofar as the term satisfies the requirement of reasonableness. 5. This section does not apply in the case of goods passing 1964 c. 71. On a redemption of trading stamps within the Trading Stamps 1965 c. 6. Act 1964 or the Trading Stamps Act Northern Ireland 1965. N.1. Other provisions about contracts. 8. 1. In the Misrepresentation Act 1967, the following is misrepre substituted for Section 3 Centation. Avoidance 3. If a contract contains a term which would 1967 c. 7. Of provision exclude or restrict excluding liability p for aa any liability tought which a y to a contract seno may be subject by reason of any misrepre sentation made by him before the contract was made, or b. any remedy available to another party to the contract by reason of such a misrepresentation. That term shall be of no effect except insofar as it satisfies the requirement of reasonableness as stated in Section 11(1) of the Unfair Contract Terms Act 1977, and it is for those claiming that the term satisfies that requirement to show that it does. 2. The same section is substituted for Section 3 of the Ms. 1967 c. 14 Representation Act Northern Ireland 1967. N.1. 9. 1. Where for reliance upon it a contract term has to effect of satisfy the requirement of reasonableness, it may be found to breach. Do so and be given effect accordingly notwithstanding that the contract has been terminated either by breach or by a party electing to treat it as repudiated. 2. Where on a breach the contract is nevertheless affirmed by a party entitled to treat it as repudiated, this does not of itself exclude the requirement of reasonableness in relation to any contract term. 10. A person is not bound by any contract term prejudicing evasion by or taking away rights of his which arise under, or in connection means o. T. F. Y with the performance of another contract, so far as those rights secondary extend to the enforcement of another's liability which this part of this Act prevents that other from excluding or restricting. B2. 6c. 50 Unfair Contract Terms Act 1977. Part 1 Explanatory Provisions. The reason 11. 1. In relation to a contract term, the requirement of ableness, reasonableness for the purposes of this part of this Act, Section Test 3 of the Misrepresentation Act 1967 and Section 3 of the Ms. 1967 c. 7. Representation Act Northern Ireland 1967 is that the term shall 1967 c. 14. Have been a fair and reasonable one to be included having regard ni to the circumstances which were, or ought reasonably to have been, known to or in the contemplation of the parties when the contract was made. 2. In determining for the purposes of Section 6 or 7 above whether a contract term satisfies the requirement of reasonableness. Regard shall be had in particular to the matters specified in Schedule 2 to this Act, but this subsection does not prevent the court or arbitrator from holding, in accordance with any rule of law, that a term which purports to exclude or restrict any relevant liability is not a term of the contract. 3. In relation to a notice not being a notice having contractual effect, the requirement of reasonableness under this Act is that it should be fair and reasonable to allow reliance on it, having regard to all the circumstances obtaining when the liability arose or but for the notice would have arisen. 4. Where by reference to a contract term or notice a person seeks to restrict liability to a specified sum of money, and the question arises, under this or any other Act, whether the term or notice satisfies the requirement of reasonableness, regard shall be had in particular but without prejudice to subsection 2 above in the case of contract terms 2. At the resources which he could expect to be available to him for the purpose of meeting the liability should it arise, and b. How far it was open to him to cover himself by insurance. 5. It is for those claiming that a contract term or notice satisfies the requirement of reasonableness to show that it does. Dealing as 12. 1. A party to a contract deals as consumer in relation consumer to another party if a. He neither makes the contract in the course of a business nor holds himself out as doing so, and b. The other party does make the contract in the course of a business, and Unfair Contract Terms Act 1977 c. 57. c. In the case of a contract governed by the law of sale of Part 1 goods or hire purchase, or by Section 7 of this Act, the goods passing under or in pursuance of the contract are of a type ordinarily supplied for private use or consumption. 2. But on a sale by auction or by competitive tender the buyer is not in any circumstances to be regarded as dealing as consumer. 3. Subject to this, it is for those claiming that a party does not deal as consumer to show that he does not. 13. 1. To the extent that this part of this Act prevents the varieties of exclusion or restriction of any liability, it also prevents c. el. xa. E. Us. Me. P. Tn. At making the liability or its enforcement subject to restrictive or onerous conditions. B. Excluding or restricting any right or remedy in respect of the liability, or subjecting a person to any prejudice in consequence of his pursuing any such right or remedy. C. Excluding or restricting rules of evidence or procedure, and to that extent Sections 2 and 5 to 7 also prevent excluding or restricting liability by reference to terms and notices which exclude or restrict the relevant obligation or duty. 2. But an agreement in writing to submit present or future differences to arbitration is not to be treated under this part of this Act as excluding or restricting any liability. 14. In this part of this Act, interpretation, business, includes a profession and the activities of any of Part 1 government department or local or public authority. Goods, has the same meaning as in the sale of goods 56 and 57 Viet. Act 1893, c. 71. Hire purchase agreement, has the same meaning as in the Consumer Credit Act 1974 c. 39. Negligence, has the meaning given by Section 1(1). Notice, includes an announcement, whether or not in writing, and any other communication or pretended communication, and personal injury, includes any disease and any impairment of physical or mental condition. 8 c. 50 Unfair Contract Terms Act 1977. Part 2. Amendment of Law for Scotland. Scope of 15. 1. This part of this Act applies only to contracts, is. Part 2. Subject to Part 3 of this Act and does not affect the validity of any discharge or indemnity given by a person in consideration of the receipt by him of compensation in settlement of any claim which he has. 2. Subject to subsection 3 below, sections 16 to 18 of this Act apply to any contract only to the extent that the contract relates to the transfer of the ownership or possession of goods from one person to another, with or without work having been done on them. B. Constitutes a contract of service or apprenticeship. C. Relates to services of whatever kind, including, without prejudice to the foregoing generality, carriage, deposit and pledge, care and custody, mandate, agency, loan and services relating to the use of land. D. Relates to the liability of an occupier of land to persons entering upon or using that land. E. Relates to a grant of any right or permission to enter upon or use land not amounting to an estate or interest in the land. 3. Notwithstanding anything in subsection 2 above, sections 16 to 18. Do not apply to any contract to the extent that the contract I is a contract of insurance including a contract to pay an annuity on human life. E. Relates to the formation, constitution or dissolution of any body corporate or unincorporated association or partnership. B. Apply to a contract of marine salvage or towage, a charter party of a ship or hovercraft, a contract for the carriage of goods by ship or hovercraft, or a contract to which subsection 4 below relates, only to the extent that I. Both parties deal or hold themselves out as dealing in the course of a business and then only insofar as the contract purports to exclude or restrict liability for breach of duty in respect of death or personal injury, or E. The contract is a consumer contract and then only in favor of the consumer. Unfair Contract Terms Act 1977 c. 59. 4. This subsection relates to a contract in pursuance of which party goods are carried by ship or hovercraft and which either A. Specifies ship or hovercraft as the means of carriage over part of the journey to be covered, or B. Makes no provision as to the means of carriage and does not exclude ship or hovercraft as that means, insofar as the contract operates for and in relation to the carriage of the goods by that means. 16. 1. Where a term of a contract purports to exclude or liability for restrict liability for breach of duty arising in the course of any breach of business or from the occupation of any premises used for business purposes of the occupier, that term A. Shall be void in any case where such exclusion or restriction is in respect of death or personal injury. B. Shall, in any other case, have no effect if it was not fair and reasonable to incorporate the term in the contract. 2. Subsection 1 above does not affect the validity of any discharge and indemnity given by a person, on or in connection with an award to him of compensation for pneumoconiosis attributable to employment in the coal industry, in respect of any further claim arising from his contracting that disease. 3. Where under subsection 1 above a term of a contract is void or has no effect, the fact that a person agreed to, or was aware of, the term shall not of itself be sufficient evidence that he knowingly and voluntarily assumed any risk. 17. 1. Any term of a contract which is a consumer contract control of or a standard form contract shall have no effect for the purposu X. Near E. M. A. P. S. T. O. I. O. N. N. A. S. B. L. I. E. N of enabling a party to the contract consumer or A who is in breach of a contractual obligation to exclude standard form or restrict any liability of his to the consumer or custo contracts. Mer in respect of the breach. B. In respect of a contractual obligation, to render no performance, or to render a performance substantially different from that which the consumer or customer reasonably expected from the contract. If it was not fair and reasonable to incorporate the term in the contract. 2. In this section, customer means a party to a standard form contract who deals on the basis of written standard terms of business of the other party to the contract who himself deals in the course of a business. 10 C. 50. Part 2. Unreasonable indemnity. Clauses in consumer contracts. Guarantee of consumer goods. Obligations implied by law in sale and hire purchase contracts. 56 and 57. Vict. C. 71. 1973 C. 13. Unfair Contract Terms Act 1977. 18. 1. Any term of a contract which is a consumer contract shall have no effect for the purpose of making the consumer indemnify another person, whether a party to the contract or not, in respect of liability which that other person may incur as a result of breach of duty or breach of contract, if it was not fair and reasonable to incorporate the term in the contract. 2. In this section, liability means liability arising in the course of any business or from the occupation of any premises used for business purposes of the occupier. 19. L. This section applies to a guarantee. A. In relation to goods which are of a type ordinarily supplied for private use or consumption, and B. Which is not a guarantee given by one party to the other party to a contract under or in pursuance of which the ownership or possession of the goods to which the guarantee relates is transferred. 2. A term of a guarantee to which this section applies shall be void insofar as it purports to exclude or restrict liability for loss or damage, including death or personal injury, arising from the goods proving defective while I. in use otherwise than exclusively for the purposes of a business, or E. in the possession of a person for such use, and B. resulting from the breach of duty of a person concerned in the manufacture or distribution of the goods. 3. For the purposes of this section, any document is a guarantee if it contains or purports to contain some promise or assurance, however worded or presented, that defects will be made good by complete or partial replacement, or by repair, monetary compensation or otherwise. 20. 1. Any terms of a contract which purports to exclude or restrict liability for breach of the obligations arising from Section 12 of the Sale of Goods Act 1893, sellers' implied undertakings as to title etc. B. Section 8 of the Supply of Goods, Implied Terms Act 1973, implied terms as to title in hire purchase agree. Ments shall be void. Unfair Contract Terms Act 1977 c. 5011. 2. Any term of a contract which purports to exclude or Part 2 restrict liability for breach of the obligations arising from Section 13, 14 or 15 of the said Act of 1893, sellers' implied undertakings as to conformity of goods with description or sample, or as to their quality or fitness for a particular purpose. B. Section 9, 10 or 11 of the said Act of 1973, the corresponding provisions in relation to hire purchased shall I. in the case of a consumer contract, be void against the consumer. E. in any other case, have no effect if it was not fair and reasonable to incorporate the term in the contract. 21. 1. Any term of a contract to which this section applies obligations purporting to exclude or restrict liability for breach of an implied by obligation L. C. A. O. W. NTR. In. AC. O. T. T. S. H. F. E. O. R. R. A. such as is referred to in subsection 3 a bellow supply of I. in the case of a consumer contract, shall be void goods against the consumer, and E. in any other case, shall have no effect if it was not fair and reasonable to incorporate the term in the contract. B. such as is referred to in subsection 3b below, shall have no effect if it was not fair and reasonable to incorporate the term in the contract. 2. This section applies to any contract to the extent that it relates to any such matter as is referred to in section 15(2) of this Act, but does not apply to a contract of sale of goods or a lure purchase agreement, or B. a charter party of a ship or hovercraft unless it is a consumer contract and then only in favor of the consumer. 3. An obligation referred to in this subsection is an obligation incurred under a contract in the course of a business and arising by implication of law from the nature of the contract which relates to the correspondence of goods with description or sample, or to the quality or fitness of goods for any particular purpose, or B. to any right to transfer ownership or possession of goods, or to the enjoyment of quiet possession of goods. 4. Nothing in this section applies to the supply of goods on a redemption of trading stamps within the Trading Stamps Act 1964 c. 71. 1964.